Hello, I'm Dr. Tobi Evans. My pronouns are he, him, and they, them. And tonight I'm joined by the absolutely fabulous Dr. Vivienne. Has worked in the film industry, in academia, is a gorgeous writer, is a parent, an icon, a vision, has the most stunning curly hair. And here we are today. So my first two questions are, firstly, what is your star sign and what are your gender pronouns?
Okay, well, gender pronouns are much easier than the stories that it'll evolve from star signs. My pronouns are they, them. I very much like the multiplicity that entails in some ways. And my star sign is Gemini.
I feel like there's a story here.
I have quite an old tattoo now on my back of two fish. Back in the days before cultural appropriation, I loved these two carps, I guess they are, and I stole them off a T-shirt that I also loved. Midway through the tattoo, somebody comes in and says, "Oh, you're Libra." And I thought they were like the twins and yin and yang and all of the Gemini things. Oh, well.
Oh dear.
Well, I love them. Everything's a story.
Yeah, and it's how you read them. Like they're two fish. It can be Gemini if you want it to be. So my first question that's not about very important things like star signs and pronouns is I'd love to hear about your gender journey.
It's a long journey. I'm 51 years old this year, and I think looking back over that time, you know, all the things that are in me now there were signs, but they were not things that I knew early. And my journey has really been about self-discovery and, you know, whose isn't. But I guess mine had quite marked different coming out phases.
Yeah.
As a kid, I was super, super shy and used to blush when anybody looked at me. And I spent more time up trees and looking after my chooks and reading books than really hanging with people.
People are overrated.
People are overrated even now, and, you know, often disappointing, but also, you know, the source of everything we learn about ourselves. I've had to make friends with people as I've gotten older. I've passed as a boy for a long time, as a small kid, and then kind of as a prepubescent kid, and loved that. And, you know, that was back in the times of being called a tomboy, and nobody really hassled me about it, I guess. I look back at some of those periods of time as being quite happy, whereas adolescence was hell on earth, and yeah, you could not pay me $1 million to go back to that period of time. And actually parenting adolescence is triggering in its own way because of those experiences. So I didn't really even understand sexuality in that early period of teenagehood. It wasn't really till I finished my first degree, a BA in film at Flinders in South Australia, and moved to Sydney. I kind of moved to Sydney to come out as a lesbian at that stage. I think there were parts of being a lesbian that were very much around gender as well. I remember you know, being accused by my first girlfriend's flatmates that I had femme passing privilege because I had long hair at that stage. So promptly got a number 2. And then, you know, found that kind of weird and confronting in its own way. I remember, you know, walking down the street after having that haircut and catching a reflection of myself and going, you know, being a bit alarmed that somebody kind of butch looking was following me, and I was like, oh, that's me.
Who's this? Yep.
After, you know, going through film school in Sydney and, you know, making films that explored sexuality in lots of ways, I became a parent. And so that was another whole coming out and being in my body kind of experience. While I'd talked about having kids with gay friends, that was kind of always how I'd visualised it. I ended up in a straight relationship. So that was really quite dysphoric, I guess, for me, you know, in retrospect, kind of realising that's the way people saw me and the judgments people make about mothers in particular and the expectations people have around how you will be in your body and how you will be with your child and how you will dress your child. And my child was born with macrocephaly, so we were told she would be severely disabled. And that was a period of postnatal depression and really quite traumatic. in many ways.
So could you tell us what microcephaly is?
So cysts in her brain. So there's another form that's hydrocephaly, which is cysts on top of the brain. This is what, like, embedded. So really, she had brain surgery when she was 8 days old. And
wow.
yeah, it was all sorts of trauma, which in retrospect kind of, makes sense of what happened over the next 10 years, which is family court and some really unpleasant relationship vibes and, some stuff that I now kind of am working through with that child, who was an awesome young human, ironically now going to film school, which is where I met her father. So there's all sorts of weird circularity there. Who's recently come out as non-binary. Did I get her pronouns? Oh, see, pronouns. It's very, I find it very challenging in a person that I've known all their life. To get, so I'm working on that.
Can I ask how you kind of sit with that, using they, them pronouns yourself, and then having your child come out as non-binary? So what's that like?
Yeah, so I guess the flip side of that is that that child, I won't mention, see, normally I get around it by using their name, and I don't wish to do that in this context just for their privacy, but it means I have to use their pronouns a lot more. So no biggie with them. They call me by my name as opposed, and are very good with pronouns. So there's very little opportunity to misgender me in my presence. And then my younger child is also very good with pronouns but calls me mum. And so that's a really interesting thing that and also actually gets misgendered constantly as well. He identifies as a boy, but has long curly hair and has quite fine, delicate features. And it's been an ongoing giggle for us in public spaces for most of our collective lives, that I'll get gendered one way or the other. Either way, it's misgendering in my humble opinion, and he'll inevitably get your daughter or little girl. But he did a really awesome little demonstration when somebody asked him this question recently about what happens, and he's like, you can see their heads go
Especially for not one person but maybe more than one people who are being misgendered or have pronouns that one wouldn't assume.
So the kind of it used to irritate me a little bit, particularly when you'd be in Bunnings and you're having a good conversation with a young man about screws or and they're relating to you as mate. And then Ari comes around the corner and says, hey, mum, and you just, on a good day, it doesn't matter at all. If I'm tired or, feeling particularly hypersensitive, it is, it's a microaggression. So it's his choice to call me that. I am his mum.
And do you feel comfortable with that term
I love
yourself?
being his parent. I call myself a parent. So if I'm introducing myself to other parents, I'll say I'm a parent. I prefer the gender neutral. But I don't, in terms of gender journey as well, going back to that period of time, I recently had top surgery, and thinking about my relationship with my breasts, it was like when they were functional and they had a purpose in relationship building, I wasn't able to feed my first child because it was interrupted with, the brain surgery, et cetera, et cetera.
But that must have been huge.
It was huge. There was there was really quite explicit trauma around. I thought she hated me. They hated me. So that, it took a long time to work through all of that nasty postnatal depression business. But with the second child much later, who I had as a single parent, he was very happily breastfed. And so, when I kind of got to the point of really being able to afford and at a time in my life have top surgery, it was like, they're done. And it feels very much like returning to the happy times that before I had boobs. So it feels not like a loss, but very much like the way I was meant to be, which is as close as I get to the always, born this way kind of narrative. It's very much been a becoming, and actually, in honour of today, nail polish, which I have not done since identifying as a female human being.
Really?
So there's some things now that I feel much more comfortable as a non-binary and transmasc human, being able to express in a femme form. There's something more queer or gay about that. So
well, they look great.
Thank you. I had to actually go and buy black nail polish.
So you mentioned that you made kind of films about gender.
One of my film school films was called Heartless, and it was around a relationship between two women, one of who's got a terminal illness, and they contract to how they're going to deal with grief and death by the one that's about to die says, you have to eat my heart, you have to make a heart out of my heart. I guess it was very much more around sexuality than gender, if you're going to divide the two. And in fact, most of those films, I got to film Kylie Minogue at Mardi Gras, and there was a lot of queer kind of exploration more than explicitly gender exploration. So it's probably more in my later work and some of the thinking through non-binary identities that I'm looking more explicitly at gender. And the impact, I guess, on that on categories, on, binary understandings of the world, them either being safe or unsafe, or categories of sport, obviously. All of the kind of queering of those edges is something that's been terminally fascinating to me. And
so interesting.
And, right back in the beginning, I wrote, that was definitely part of who I was. I think not wanting to be visible in the world, like wanting to be a bit hidden because I was so shy, and then not wanting to be categorised, just wanting to be outside of whatever box people were assuming for me. Which is kind of, I guess, what I ended up going into in terms of a PhD. So that was post-second child.
Oh, wow. So 2 children and doing a PhD, that's...
Well, I actually had a great plan that it was the best way to avoid postnatal depression.
Okay, yeah, I see that. There's no time for anything in a PhD, so...
It worked, Toby. It was great.
Oh, great. I'm so glad.
I was, happily just doing too many things. The PhD was also, it was quite applied in practice in the early stages. It was a exploring digital storytelling workshop, so really kind of going into some of the stuff that my film work was also interested in around voice and the ethics of telling stigmatised stories. Some of the docos I'd done post-film school were, Vietnamese community parents who had drug-addicted kids or were drug-addicted themselves, or drug-dependent, I should say. So, the impact of those stories in and for the Vietnamese community was highly wrought. So, we did things in those films to de-identify some people, and to tell their stories through animation. And then, that was also an interesting challenge because it was bilingual and I don't speak Vietnamese.
Oh, wow. So you just were like, I'll just take on this tiny task of making bilingual films.
And I edited it, which I had no idea, actually, the complications of trying to, pick the end of a sentence in a atonal or tonal language where you can't pick the end of a sentence. So I worked really closely with some fantastic Vietnamese community members there. And actually that was also the time where I started to learn a lot about Buddhism, which is again related to gender in terms of multiplicity and fluidity and not being attached to, the way your body is interpreted in the world, being more of a spirit that can move between identities.
I love that. That's very cool.
That's also the thing I love about they is, so for me it is, I'm quite happy to embrace the multiplicity of that rather than call it a singular, because I think of myself as all of these different people that, are trapped in this body, right? And, I think that it also gives me a sense of being able to be courageous or curious in terms of going forward, like wearing black nail polish, because I don't have to match up with some previous version of myself. I can be whoever I want to be.
Absolutely. So something that you mentioned and that I would love to hear more about is the book I know you're working on right now, which is about safe spaces and brave spaces. So could you tell us what that means? Like, what is a safe space? What is a brave space?
Yeah. So again, this really came, I guess, out of thinking through privacy and, you know, the impact of stories when they're in a public domain and your life moves on, but you've got, in the case of many people that I was working with, this little 3-minute kind of who I am digital story that's no longer true. But it was authentic and it was real at the time, and you know, it was the source of your great activism, and so, you know, this kind of idea of everyday activism being things that we do and are every day, but there are impacts that you can't anticipate because they're not within this period of time. So in terms of safety and facilitating groups of whatever kind of workshop you might be you know, working with, and in that period of time it was digital stories, and more recently, I guess, in Transgender Victoria context, it's more around peer support and how you can facilitate a group with really mixed needs, with people who you can assume will have a degree of trauma, whatever shape or form that may be, and who will be in really different stages of their journey as well. So they may be quite self-righteous and need the security of a label, which is contested by somebody else in the group. So how do you kind of hold that space in a way that is safe? And I guess I got to the point where I just went, we can't. It's actually an aspirational concept, and that's fine. It's a great thing to strive for, but I can't guarantee it. And I think actually the idea of guaranteeing it is really problematic, and something that, you know, we routinely try and do in health spaces or education spaces. You know, speak freely because you're in a safe space. It's a bit not real. The book basically argues, through a bunch of interviews with a bunch of really fascinating and excellent people, and absolutely the best part of doing a book kind of post-academia as well, so I didn't really have to think about writing in a specific tone.
Freedom.
So good to not have to kind of structure an article in terms of, well, here are my methods, and here are, you know, it's quite ethnographic. Some parts of it are very much around, you know, becoming non-binary and navigating boundaries, particularly things like national borders. So getting an X in my passport, which I was stoked about, but, you know, then you travel to the US and it doesn't exist. And, you know, then if you need to be patted down and it needs to be done by somebody of the same gender as you, who are they going to get? You know, where's the non-binary security guard who you're supposed to feel comfortable with? So that, you know, there's a philosophical kind of interest in those categories, and also the interest and understanding where safe spaces came from in terms of separate spaces, and particularly gendered separate spaces. So in you know, historical stages of the women's movement, why we needed a separate space for women, and why people like our favourite author of Harry Potter will argue that we still need those separate spaces, and women who are assigned female at birth and still have vaginas need to be in their own spaces and therefore exclude other people. You know, there's sections of the book that look at those histories and those contested kind of spaces, and, you know, cancel culture and what's the impact of just shutting down discussion about it. What does transformative justice look like in terms of, you know, the space is no longer safe, but now how do we apologise and how do we kind of get past our differences to really grow without, you know, turning to systems that we know are oppressive and problematic. So the interviews are with fantastic people who, you know, from the Commissioner of LGBTQI plus communities, Ro Allen.
So jealous.
I spoke to Jude, the chair of VPC, the Victorian Pride Centre, around conceiving of a space that architecturally would be safe for all of these diverse needs. I spoke to an escort and a person who facilitates intimacy parties. So, you know, again, as a non-binary person in a gendered sexual space, how do you do that? A tattoo artist who you know, was, you know, of course, it's like
Yeah, yeah. Up in your business.
Yeah. Everything is, you know, tied in with who I am. So it was not difficult to find these awesome people to speak to about safe spaces and how they think about it. But basically, the argument is that we need to ditch that idea and talk about brave spaces, and how can we create spaces that are safe enough or safer or safe-ish, that people feel able to be brave, acknowledging their trauma, acknowledging that they're likely to be triggered by other people, that could happen at any point, that, you know, somebody else could come into the room and that's just like enough to make the space no longer safe. So how do we do that as participants, and then how do we hold that as facilitators? It's you know, it's definitely not easy.
No.
It's not something we can ever do perfectly. And this is, you know, the final sort of section of tips is, you know, really articulating that and including that in the framing of the space, that, you know, we're hoping for good enough. We're hoping that you feel brave enough to trust in one another, have compassion with one another, practice the ways that you can exit the space if and when, or, you know, if you've had enough, so that kind of learning of imperfection and not very good is also routine and easy, albeit uncomfortable. Yeah, so that's kind of the manuscript that I'm currently rewriting, and it's never going to be good enough, and it needs to be submitted at the end of the month.
Oh, wow. Okay, so the pressure is on. So how would you define a brave space, and how is it different from a safe space?
So in effect, it can be quite similar. I think it's in the framing. There's an acknowledgement that the aspiration of safety is not a guarantee. And I can't guarantee that I can create a space where you will be brave either, but that's what I'm aiming for. You're sharing that framing really explicitly with participants. So there's an acknowledgement up front that it could go wrong, and there's a rehearsal around, if it goes wrong, what will we do? And I use things like the traffic lights. So, you know, red's too uncomfortable, I can't cope, I need to exit. Orange is, you know, it's okay, you know, it's not great. But so you're inviting people to be in the orange rather than guaranteeing the green. And I think that's, you know, it's a tweak, but it's a significant tweak. And I think if you have a commitment from participants to allow themselves to sit with discomfort and be uncomfortable, that's a very different commitment to an expectation that they'll be 100% comfortable the whole time. And it might not be the right space for some people. So it's an opportunity to self-exclude too at that point, which is kind of, I think it's the smoke and mirrors, the sleight of hand in terms of facilitating a good enough space, is choosing who's in the room. Because there are some people that actually are too volatile. It's not the right time in their lives. It's, you know, they're then realistically not able to be brave, or their version of courage will potentially be angry and cause harm to other participants. So really trying to minimise the potential for continued harm is a big thing, I think, in brave spaces.
Awesome. So it sounds like this was partially informed by your work at Transgender Victoria, and you're the Chief Operating Officer there.
That is correct.
Very fancy.
I know, right? Such a title.
Very cool. What else informed your decision to write a whole book on safe spaces and brave spaces?
It really is a bit of a hangover from, it's quite recent that I'm at Transgender Victoria full time, and it was only 3 years ago, I guess, where I was really still gunning for a career in academia. That I still, you know, there's moments every now and then where I look at peers from that period where I have some regrets, but realistically, I think I dodged a bullet at the beginning of COVID, and at a time when you know, universities are not safe spaces for a very large majority of people. Being openly non-binary, I think, does have its impact. You know, I wasn't my background wasn't explicitly in gender studies. It was in media and communications. So going for jobs in sociology or media comms as a non-binary human was always a little bit confusing for interview committees. So I think that had its impact. You know, things will be, and I do have some faith in the curly pathways that life takes, and I'm very, very honoured and happy to be where I am now. It's not without its own challenges. You know, there are, as a filmmaker, I learnt lots about small business management, and, you know, I'm not a particularly articulate numerate person. Can you be articulate and numerate? Anyway, at about the kind of, you know, part of my coming out process, which I actually didn't talk about earlier, is discovering neurodiversity and going, you know, no wonder. So I think, again, in academia, that's a little bit of a problem in terms of working with teams and having really clear communication with a small team. You know, Transgender Victoria is in a period of growth, going from, you know, wholly volunteer managed and led to being lucky enough to have some paid staff. Community expectations of us are very high, and they should be, but it means that, you know, the potential to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing is also very great. So, yeah, it's challenging in different ways. I do feel like I'm continually learning, which is, again, it's great.
So tying into that, the idea of kind of coming out multiple times and this continual becoming is something that I feel has come up a few times. And I know in one of your recent blogs, you talked about making art about who you are and who you're becoming. So that really resonated with me as a trans person, and I imagine a lot of other people, because when you're trans, you're in this weird position where your past and your present and your future might not kind of line up in the ways that people might expect. You know, they might assume you have one past, but you have a different past. They might assume you have one future, but you have a different future. So I'd love to hear more about what you were kind of thinking about and talking about when you talked about that, you know, idea of, you know, who you are and who you're becoming, and how you grapple with that kind of past, present, future self.
Which is kind of, you know, the Buddhist or the queer, you know, whether it's queer theory or Buddhist, they all have similar kind of philosophies and overlapping ideas in these spaces, I think. I have to say that it's much easier for me to be walking the walk and talking the talk in Melbourne, because a lot of my extended family networks and friends are in Adelaide or Sydney. And so there's a kind of opportunity in only running into people that I've met within the last 4 years that gives me a bit of freedom. So I'm kind of, having said that, you know, online, there's none of those borders. So a lot of the work that I was doing in the PhD and in subsequent work around storytelling and the personal and the activist in online spaces is around reconciling those different versions of self and kind of claiming them and celebrating them. So I guess that's largely the way that I think about gender and think about being now. And the stuff, you know, I don't really call myself an artist. Art is something that I've always done, and it's for me. And, you know, I actually do kind of think maybe one day I'll display some stuff, and or you know, it'd be great to do an exhibition. But the stuff that I like to make highlights and showcases the multiplicity, and like sometimes really explicitly, like the Stories Beyond Gender project that I worked with trans community members in Adelaide on was an exhibition of their social media creative productions. So making memes or making little digital stories that used technology to highlight multiple versions of themselves. So if there was a before and after photo, that would be on their terms and it would showcase aspects of themselves that they wanted to talk about, rather than, you know, it being a shaming thing that was imposed upon them, or something that was, you know, discovery that was outed. So that was really interesting, you know, working with parents of trans kids in particular, because, you know, I guess this is where it gets a little bit more complex. It's all very easy to say, oh, we're all multiple and, you know, why be shamed? But, you know, I have also a history of drug use, and there are some contexts where you don't want that to be, you know, it's not something you put on your CV. So similarly for trans kids, you know, having a public profile as a trans kid, you can never be stealth. and that may, you know, it's foreclosing options and possibilities. And so some of the parents and kids I worked with thought very carefully about pseudonymizing or making pseudonymous. It's much easier to write than say their stories, so that they weren't necessarily easy to recognise. I use pseudonymous rather than anonymous because they are always easy to pin down if you know enough about an individual person or story. So again, it's a bit like safe and brave. I don't think you can be anonymous online, and you can't tell an anonymous story in a public space without it being connected in some permanent way to your identity.
So something that kind of leads into is the idea of everyday activism. So I'd love to hear a bit more about what that is.
It is stuff that we do every day. It's sometimes stuff that we step into by choice. So, you know, deciding whether you're going to correct pronouns or have the conversation with an auntie about top surgery, in my case, which I did in a dog park on the phone, like the day before.
Just so you know, there's no going back.
Yeah, I mean, that's a form of everyday activism in my humble opinion. It's stuff that you undertake with a hope that it's going to change the world in some small way, whether that's in personal relationships. There's a wing of my family that are Christian, and, you know, they've kind of, I think the first interviews that I recorded with them on camera, which is a period of my life I was trying to make a documentary about conceiving a second child as a single lesbian, and I dragged all of my Christian family members onto the camera and said, what do you think about this? And they said horrible things like, well, we won't be able to talk to our kids about it because in our faith system, you know, we believe there's a man and a woman, and that's how you make children, and that's just how it is. And my mum, bless her, said, families are not things you construct. They are things that just are. They've always been. And I was like, Mum, families were made up by capitalism and industrialisation. You know, it's actually, they haven't always been.
Yeah. Let's take the genealogy out.
Yeah, it never got made as a film because it was just way too complex. And but you know, the stories, the processes of doing those interviews and having really difficult conversations did change the world in our little ways. Those people have, you know, they accept me in some fashion or other now. They might roll their eyes when they hear about my latest incarnation. They don't have to understand it. But their kids are all now adults, off in their lives, and, you know, they've got a reference point now for somebody who doesn't fit those boxes. And, you know, there's been plenty of opportunity, I guess, where I've been in a position where I've had a platform where I can talk about these things, and that does have an impact, you know, in terms of representation, what you're doing here, and, you know, being able to see what we look like is, while it's deeply uncomfortable in lots of ways, it makes a difference.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what I call everyday activism, I guess, is the, and it's interesting, it links back, the penny hadn't dropped till now, it links back to the idea of being brave. And, you know, being brave is also a privilege. It's not something that we can demand of people. Yeah. There's plenty of times in my life when I've not been able to be brave. And, you know, I spoke briefly about drugs. There's been, you know, large periods of my life where I've just needed to hide and blanket because it was all too painful. You know, if you have capacity, even if it's fleeting, and you've got the patience and the compassion to challenge ignorance or, you know, in some cases, willful misgendering and hate, then, you know, I hope that we're able to do it, and I hope that we as a queer community are able to have one another's backs enough that we can support one another in doing that, and to not kind of tear one another down for not being trans enough or, you know, traumatised enough. I think sometimes we get into trauma hierarchies. And trauma is, you know, there's no hierarchy. Oppression is definitely, you know, there's different levels of oppression, but how we experience trauma is not logical and not measurable in those ways. I don't think. Maybe that's with privilege that I say that.
So one thing that's really striking me is there's a lot of those moments of bravery throughout the stories you've told us, but also a lot of moments of joy and happiness.
Yeah.
So the question I'd like to end on is, what is bringing you joy at the moment, whether
Yeah.
it's a big thing, a small thing,
Yeah.
what's making you happy?
It's the dog walk at the end of the day by the creek that I look forward to every day. I think in terms of a kind of bigger narrative, the stuff that keeps me getting out of bed and keeps me dealing with depression on an ongoing basis is joy for learning. And
Learning is the best.
Just like it's crazy the number of little rabbit holes that I'll jump down in terms of renovating a camper van, learning how to build a pool, like permaculture I studied for a whole period of time, massage I've done for the things that I have done degrees for, and I don't think it's ever going to end. I'm just constantly wanting to. I've just signed up for a process-oriented psychology, trauma-informed dream interpretation series of workshops.
I'm obsessed.
It's going to be great.
So you need to come back and talk to us about dream interpretation.
Yeah. It does actually, ironically, connect back to brave spaces and facilitate. Like sometimes there are ghosts in the room that you've got to sort of feel and intuit. And I think you get good skills at that from listening to dreams and kind of tuning in to, the subconscious kind of hippie messages or whatever we may brand them as. Learning new stuff.
And I can see very much that also brings you a lot of joy, just the way
it does. Yeah. I love a new subject. I've got bees too. That's another interview.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for having a chat with me today, and thank you for being so open and honest about your experiences and sharing. I feel like we've just tapped into the tiniest sliver of your life and your brilliance today, but thank you so much for being brave with me and sharing all of the different stories that you've got. My name is Dr. Tobi Evans, and my very special guest today has been Dr. Son Vivienne. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was lovely.
Pleasure.